Hello, and welcome to the next episode of The Prestige, a podcast about films, filmmaking, and film theory.
In each programme, we'll focus on a particular movie, and whilst up until now we've been restrictive about our pre-arranged themes, we're doing a few tweaks. The first of which, a bit more organic, about letting a theme develop from our reviews, discussions, rants, arguments.
We'll still end with some recommendations based on each week's choice, but we're hoping to go for a more natural feel to the whole thing. And we're still going to start by introducing ourselves, but we might change that up a bit too.
So this week, I am going to introduce us both.
Oh, God.
So I'll be nice. My name's Rob Maythorne. I spent the last 10 years working in the film industry in the UK, working on everything from big Hollywood films on set to tiny little Welsh language shows that no one's ever heard of. And my colleague on this podcast is Sam Knowles, who is a decorated teacher and lecturer and writer. He tends to spend his time writing about books, about travel, about movies and about games and about graphic novels, and he's certainly the smart one of the two of us.
Decorated makes it sound like I've won medals. I like it.
I feel with all those graduation robes there's some decoration in there,
But our final change is that we're going to take it in turns to choose the film, because otherwise it's going to turn into a Kevin Smith podcast. This week it was... Yeah, exactly. So this week it was my choice, and I have picked The Apartment. So some notes about this. It was released in 1960 with a young Shirley MacLaine and young-ish, well, he's older than us but still young, Jack Lemmon. It's about a junior accounting executive, C.C. Baxter, who, to be blunt, is thoroughly bullied by his superiors into giving up his apartment rent-free as a crash pad for use in their extramarital affairs. And because he's naive and pliable, and also because he wants promotion, Baxter goes along with this bizarre schedule, even though it means he has to leave his flat for long periods. And his neighbours, who have to put up with the noise and the mess, think he's a right Lothario. Then he falls for a lift operator, Shirley MacLaine, in his building, and his placid attitude is severely tested when he finds that she's the on-off girlfriend of his married boss, Mr. Sheldrake, one of the frequenters of Baxter's apartment. So this is basically where it opens. Rob, your thoughts?
Well, anyone who listens to the podcast knows that my tastes tend towards the less mainstream and certainly the newer. Most of my film collection starts in the mid-80s and goes from there. Mm-hmm. My wife often comments that I don't like old films. And so I kind of went into this week with a bit of trepidation. This sort of thing really isn't the sort of thing I choose to watch. But I bloody loved it.
Good.
Yeah, it was really... not what I was expecting. We'll touch on more of this down the line a little bit, but it was far darker than I was expecting it to be. It was far longer, and it had a lot more nuance to the characters and to the situation than I suppose I kind of expected. I think I'm a big fan of Mad Men, and one of the ideas I have of that show is that's the true story of that era, and a lot of the culture and the output from that time isn't true. But I really feel that this, there's a lot of depth to it. I think it was equal parts funny and sort of not harrowing, but emotionally sad. I think that the two leads were amazing. I want to be Jack Lemmon, and I kind of want to be with Shirley MacLaine. But no, I really, really liked it. Yourself?
Although I am less in your way of thinking about films in general, and perhaps more open to the idea of maybe older films, more classic films, I am like you a bit. I went into this film a bit. I wasn't sure what I was going to think about it, and it is my recommendation for this week. So I had more of a sense that I was going to like it than you were necessarily, but I was genuinely surprised by how much I enjoyed this film. And well, to start with, one of the early things that Baxter does, and it was interesting that you mentioned Mad Men there, because it's something that happens a lot in Mad Men, is that he engaged with pop culture, and that's something that we've looked at in previous weeks with Reservoir Dogs and Clerks, and there was a great awareness of the medium of film itself. And when he's flicking through the channels at the beginning, and his dissatisfaction about his own life is shown through how he doesn't want to watch a particular film, or he gets frustrated by the advert. And I thought the central performances, Lemmon was very good. More than that, actually, it was a brilliant combination of frustration that the situation is placed in by this social structure, and yet desire to progress within the same structure. And I think that was something that sort of complexity was something I wasn't necessarily expecting from it. I thought McLean was also very good, and particularly in the early restaurant scene with Sheldrake. I was looking this up afterwards. She didn't win any Academy Awards at this stage in her career. I mean, her earliest was into the 80s, I suppose the next generation of her career, which kind of surprised me actually. She is quoted as saying that she was down for a Best Actress award until someone else fell ill, and then necessarily they were going to get it because they had this adversity backstory. She was worthy of it here, although, as she said, it was maybe someone else's turn. I thought the bit with the broken mirror was almost mistaken identity comedy, and then it really wasn't. So there's something about this film that was almost slapstick. Like it was verging on the comedic situation, and yet never was. What McLean says with the broken mirror is, I like it, it makes me look the way I feel. And that's actually a really powerful line. And suddenly it wasn't a comedy at all. And there was that, you get wrong-footed by this film at regular intervals.
I would completely echo that. Even in the first half an hour of the film, I think I thought I was getting one sort of film. And then, I think, given the film's been out 50 years, I'm happy to put some spoilers in there. And then there's a scene in which the McLean character tries to kill herself. And this completely just kind of left-fielded me on this film.
Yeah.
And I think that scene and one other element to it really kind of showed me the bridge of these genres. And the other element is the neighbour, who I really liked as a character. But in many other films, that character would have been played straight as comedy relief. If you think about something like Breakfast at Tiffany's, whilst having issues around racism, the neighbour is straight comedy relief. Whereas on this, like, he was comedy relief, and then he suddenly wasn't. And he was like an active part of the plot. And, you know, he was, shall we say, very Jewish in his portrayal on the screen. And I think that he kept it in that kind of line of being funny without being slapstick. And I think this film, I suppose it's a difference between being funny and being fun. And I would say this film probably isn't fun, but it is funny.
Yeah. Well, like you're saying, he could have been comic relief, and then there were really poignant bits with him where he says, well, having tended to Shirley MacLaine after a suicide attempt, he says, I'm not going to take any money for this. At that point, he really wasn't a stock comic character at all. I know what you're saying about spoilers, but I really think people should watch this film for the last scene, which is just brilliant. It was totally not what I expected, and there is a visual, not gag because it's not funny, but there's a sort of visual element to it, and you think, well, this is almost a completely different film. Like, at the end, the film could have had a very different ending to the one it does. You think, hang on, where's this film going?
I think that it's from the 60s, so it's hard to say if it subverts tropes or it predates them. But if you go into this film thinking it's one thing, any one thing, you're going to be wrong. Whether you think it's a drama, a rom-com, a slapstick comedy, a workplace comedy, it's kind of all of these things and more. But just to jump over a little bit, the one sort of word and one thought came back to was Kafka.
Yes.
Now, this film, for what is generally quite a mainstream comedy film, felt incredibly Kafkaesque. Everything from the very early scenes when you've got C.C. Baxter working at his desk, and you've got this almost surreal, bizarre, vanishing point number of desks behind him.
Yes.
In which he's a worker ant, I grant you. In just a bit of film knowledge, like, they made that effect by having all the desks which were real, but having them get progressively smaller and smaller in real life.
Right.
And having people sit at them who are progressively smaller and smaller and smaller. The back row where it's kids.
That's so cool.
And that's how they made that effect. I mean, it's... I would say it's very early in the film, but it's so kind of surreal, this image of him, and then as he kind of goes up and up in the rooms through his desks. But also, I think Kafka's kind of a lot about the everyman crushed beneath the wheels of unseen forces. And whilst they aren't unseen forces here, for me, the overriding message and overriding theme of the film is about societal value.
Yes.
Every character in this is crushed and constrained by either their own personal values or values that they have to jump, the hoops they have to jump through to get where they want to. So they all have their end goal in mind because they can't see another option, and then they're crushed by the process to get there. C.C. Baxter had so many outs from his world. He could have got out of his predicament so many times by telling the truth, but he couldn't. In his mind, telling the truth about what was going on to his bosses, to his neighbours, to his girl, which wasn't an option because of his constraint within these values of society.
And that makes the bit at the end when he finally breaks free from it just the most amazing catharsis for him, but also for the viewer, because there's no, like you said, there are all those times where he could have got out of it but didn't. It's been building up and we've been thinking, come on, you can get out of this, and then finally he does. He's released from this treadmill.
To add to that, I think there's another thing, that all the characters in his office, are Mr. Somebody.
Yeah.
To the point where it gets slightly confusing of who all the Misters are, but they're Mr. Somebody, Mr. Sheldrake, Mr. This. And that adds to that kind of surreal feeling of almost an impersonal god guiding Baxter through this story.
Yeah.
That he could just walk away from if he wanted to, but he's just wagging to this train. And as you say, the ending is when he can go, no, I'm done. And that's sort of the catharsis of the film.
Those of you who know us both will be quite surprised by the fact that Rob's mentioned Kafka, and also the fact that I didn't think of Kafka at all. I thought about Alice in Wonderland. Like you were saying, he makes the step up in the world. And when he was carrying his things from his desk through the ranks of desk towards his office and then upstairs, it was this idea of, well, maybe it's a Kafkaesque situation, but it's something that is so... It just takes on elements of the surreal in a way that normal things do in Alice in Wonderland. So I was thinking about that. Well, like you say, with all the misters, I was thinking with similar roles in Alice in Wonderland when, well, whether it's Alice through the Looking Glass or Alice in Wonderland, but this idea of she can't escape from this kind of dreamlike situation. There was that element to it as well, that he could never escape from it whenever he was given an out, because he was caught up in this dream, or whether it's a dream or a nightmare.
I would agree that there's certainly a dream-like nature to it. I mean, from my point of view, from the film point of view, I thought it was very interesting, the stage design of the whole film. I mean, the two things that really struck me is, if you look at his three offices through the film, he starts off at a desk in a room for people, then he goes to his own office, but it's got glass windows, and then he goes to his third office, which is on the top floor, but has no windows to anyone else. He works by himself, isolated from the world. As he progresses up this ladder, he's more and more removed from his fellow man. That initially he's with them, and then there's actually like a see-through but physical barrier, and then finally he ends up in this room where he has no interaction, there's no view to anyone else, he's just in a little box. He says 3 windows, but they look out onto the sky rather than anyone else. That loss of the everyman quality in his kind of relationship to the rest of the world, his buying into the values of the corporate life rather than the sort of the societal life that are mirrored in that. And I think there's also kind of something to be said for the design of his house. Films of this era didn't tend to show that kind of homeliness.
How do you mean?
The house, his flat that he lives in, is very homely. It's very real worldy. You know, you've got mixed furniture, you see the kitchen, bathroom. It feels like someone actually really lives there. And if you compare that to certainly his office, which feels almost clinical in its portrayal, there's very, if any, personalisation. Even in his offices, when he has his own office, you don't know it's his office.
No.
The most you get is a hat and a jacket, but they are as uniform as anything else.
I was going to say, he makes a point of saying that the hat is something for work, and he makes this big song and dance about getting a new hat for work. So even that marker of homeliness, of it being his office, is necessarily part of his uniform, part of the fact that he is tied to work.
I would agree. I think that the point I'm trying to make is that almost in the psyche of C.C. Baxter, you've got this room, this flat that is his home, and almost a real life, a complete life. But he spends the first half of the film being actively kept out of that room and thus that life by his decision to buy into the other one. And in the film, it's very physical. He's kept out of his flat. But I think that there's a subtext there, an analogy there of him being kept out of that kind of life. And I think it's noticeable that the end scene, which we're not going to talk about too much about, that happens in his flat. It doesn't happen on the streets or in Central Park or Empire State or any of these kind of classic New York romantic moments. It doesn't happen at the office. It doesn't happen at a party. It happens in this run-down, homely, threadbare flat, because that's as flat as him in his life.
I was thinking about this, actually, as you were talking. It's significant what this film is called for that reason, because the apartment is the main character in this film. I mean, it may be starring Jack Lemmon, it may be introducing a young Shirley MacLaine, but it's not. It is really about that flat, with good reason. As you said, the reason they come back to the apartment, and the reason the film ends with the apartment, is that it's particularly important.
The apartment certainly, whilst being particularly, is also the MacGuffin of the film.
Yeah,
It's weird in that it's the journey, it's the inciting incident, it's almost the mentor as well. Him getting the apartment back, even when he's much more bought into the world of the corporate ladder and his flat being used, he's very much like, I'm ill, I need my flat, I want my flat back for a night. And there's a great sequence where he tries to organise moving all the people around so he can have one night in the flat by himself.
yes,
Which doesn't work out. But all through it, even when he's bought into that world, there's still an element of him trying to get that flat back. And I think his illness is a very key moment in that when he's at his lowest, he doesn't want time off from work, he doesn't want anyone, he just wants his flat for a night.
and in that respect, it becomes even more like a character that he just wants to spend time with. I was thinking also about. It's interesting what you said about the suicide attempt, Shirley MacLaine, and the film takes a very different turn. But once you've established that that's where the film's going, you sort of readjust your bearings. You think, okay, I know where I am now. And then there's a mention of another suicide attempt, and it adjusts again. So it's like this film just continually throws off your perceptions of which genre we're settling in. And doesn't let you settle.
Something also to be said from the comedy of distance, I suppose I'd say. In that, like, when we watch these old films, things can be funny because of our distance from the time rather than their actual intent to be funny. In particular, this film, I talk about her brother-in-law. Her brother-in-law, when you watch this film, is almost a comedy character. New York, taxi cab from the 60s. He's almost so that way that he becomes comedy. But I do wonder how much of that comedy comes from our distance from that time.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Because obviously some of it is slapstick and some of it's comedy, but I wonder whether, because that character over time has become such a trope and such a stereotype, that it's now funny, but would it have been funny to them then? I don't know if there's an answer beyond talking to someone from the 60s, but I do think that we have to bear that in mind when we talk about these things, is that some things are only funny by our distance from it.
I have to adjust what I was thinking now, because I didn't think the brother-in-law was funny at all, and I just thought the whole situation was deeply sad. And it's maybe because it comes on the back of a juxtaposition with Mr. Sheldrake and his life at home. But I was primed to think about family and how these two characters, Baxter and Fran, don't really have families. In the case of Fran, she doesn't have a family which understands her, and that was something that I thought when the brother-in-law came in, and I felt particularly sad about that situation. I wasn't thinking of him as a comedy character at all. But I can see what you're saying. The interaction between the brother-in-law and Baxter is very comedic. There is an element of slapstick in that.
You've basically said what I was trying to say, but better. I feel like his story character, and what he did in the story and what he was there to do, is sad. It's the overprotective brother. It's her having no family, but his kind of the way of talking about New York from the streets kind of thing.
Yes, yeah.
That's where I'm like, I couldn't work out which film he was from. If you see what I'm saying.
Right, I see.
And my point was that I found his mannerisms funny, but I thought I'm finding them funny because I live in 2015, and this has become so trope based that it's no longer a serious thing. It's like, as an example, the 1920s high trousers.
Yeah.
That at the time are a style and no one questions them. But if I went out wearing them now, or I saw someone in a film wearing them, like, that's kind of funny because they're incredibly high. But I think that's, as I was saying, the distance from it makes his mannerisms funny, or at least a disconnect from his plot role.
Well, I'm not sure either. You're right. It would. I wanted to also think some more about the character of Fran herself. Like, what is the role of Fran in this film, and what does it have to say about the role of women?
I think that the film kind of does bad things in that it kind of makes all women either mistresses, ex-mistresses, clueless wives, or kind of the nag. I can't think of a character in it that isn't in those categories.
Doctor's wife falls into two of those categories, and that she's a clueless wife and a nag.
Yes.
So you're right. The women in this film do not come off well. In spite of that, does Fran do interesting things?
I think she does, in that ultimately she's the one with agency at the end of the film. I think that very often, we tend to view, films at least tend to view women as prizes to be won, and that almost that a lot of rom-coms fall into what I'd call sort of the Hercules films, where the man has to overcome all these obstacles to be worthy of the woman. Maybe those obstacles are moving out of home, or not seeing his wife, or whatever. Like, it's all about his growth, or someone's growth to become worthy of that love, and then they go and claim that love. Great example is Pretty Woman, when he at the end rocks up, gets the girl, and he has the agency to go and get her, as if she's an inert object to kind of win. Whereas in this, Baxter's kind of given up. At the end, he's kind of opted out from it. He makes the big decision to step away from his corporate life, but it isn't for her. He's just like, you know what, this isn't for me. But when it comes to the conclusion of the film, she is the one with agency, even up to the almost very final line.
Yes, exactly.
She's the one making the calls. She's the one making decisions to do these things. I think that films from the 60s, and even films these still suffer from problems around females, and a lot of films are product of their time. But I certainly did feel that Fran very much had her own mind, and even early on, when there's a lot about how everyone's trying to date her and no one can. Admittedly, she's always presented as a dateable object rather than an object of herself. But I think that she has some age, and she has some spunk to her, in that the way she talks to the men isn't subservient, it isn't small compared to them.
Yeah, and also the attempts of Baxter to be protective of her, or the attempts of everyone to be protective of her, are seen to be redundant. The doctor says, with care that verges on being patronising, like, this may happen again after the suicide attempt. And a lot of the rest of the film is a visual gag, or a running gag about Fran trying to kill herself, except she doesn't, and she has no interest in doing so. And it's all in Baxter's head that she might be doing something like that, and with him sort of hiding sharp objects from her and things like that, in this environment in which men are seen to be incredibly patronising to women and behave in this way. She has the agency to say, you cannot define me. And her response to Baxter being protective of her is sort of a feature of.
So I think that the film is notable that it's kind of takes place in New York. But unlike a lot of New York films, New York didn't feel like a character in it.
No. And that's interesting when we talked about the apartment being a character, and when you say the interesting things you say about the office and the scenes in the office and what is done with the set there. It does either take place in the apartment or in the office. There's no sense of, like you said, of New York as a character, of the wider world. It's quite claustrophobic, and it also answered this element of a dreamlike quality to the film, because there's no exterior surface at all.
There's no sense of place. I mean, obviously there's a sense of like small places as in location, but there's no sense of placing these things. I mean, he says in the very opening monologue where his flat is, but it doesn't matter, and where his office is doesn't matter. There's a running thing through the film, but he's now on floor 27, now on floor 17. You get the feeling that almost these localised spaces matter far more to the film than its general place in the world.
Yes, like you said, you can't see the outside world from the windows.
No,
that final office, when there are windows on the outside world, you've still got no frame of reference. The location in the building seems to matter much more than where the building is.
And I think that adds to almost the timeless quality of it. Probably this is a film from 55 years ago, but it didn't feel like a film from 55 years ago. It felt like a story that could be told tomorrow. The fact that it isn't placed in a certain worldly place adds to that timeless feeling, and that feeling that it kind of could exist anywhere to anyone. The only other point I've got to raise, and I don't have an answer to this, is whether there's something in the idea of this being an early 60s film and it being about almost the rejection of the monoculture of corporate America. Obviously the 60s saw the birth of the counterculture movement, and whilst it isn't a hippie film in any way, a lot of it is about the pointlessness and the rejection of corporate life.
Yeah.
Whether knowingly or unknowingly, Billy Wilder here is shadowing some of that dissatisfaction that was existing with the American dream and the nuclear family and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you see, that's really interesting, because when you think of dissatisfaction with the American dream, you think of hippies and taking drugs and thinking, okay, I'm going to stick it to the man and I'm going to go on a road trip. You don't think of people within the American dream, within this idea of corporate America, thinking, I'm deeply unhappy with my lot in life, which is what you get from C.C. Baxter.
Yeah, I think there's a dominance of things like Easy Rider being, well, that's the filmic, counterculture. And stylistically, it certainly is, that kind of very much play with the idea of what a film was and how to make a film. But I do think that films like this, which very much do follow the rules of what of a narrative proscenium arch style film, still have a lot to say about that kind of American, the death of the American dream or death of the American family that happened in the 60s. I think that there's the Doctor, who does seem to have a very happy marriage. Obviously, they are clueless about Baxter and his activities, but they seem happy, they seem in love, they have a party, and you've got that portrayed as a family. But then you've got Mr. Sheldrake and his family, who are almost the pinnacle of the American dream. Big house, big job, 2.4 kids. And we all know from that film that it's an utter lie.
Yes.
And I think there's something in here about the growing disillusionment of that American dream.
I was thinking when you said that of the families in It's a Wonderful Life and how this sort of scene of someone on the phone and other people crowding round is something that maybe this film is doing something with, and saying people were unhappy and did have secret lives, and it wasn't all... I suppose It's a Wonderful Life isn't particularly uplifting until the end, but there was very much this idea of the happy American family, and that's something you certainly don't get in this film. Yeah, so I think this film is a lot cleverer than perhaps it's given credit for as a film, as an early Billy Wilder film.
It's certainly cleverer than I give credit for, I will admit. I think one thing we've touched on throughout this whole podcast is the ending of this film. And I think one of the strengths of this film is its ending. I think some of the films that exist these days, and it's the time, work very hard to tie up all the loose ends, I'd say. And this film doesn't seek to. It doesn't tell you what happens next. It doesn't seek to tell you everything's going to work out well. We've mentioned that Baxter tends to sort of reject the corporate life at the end and walks out of his job, but you don't see him get another job. You don't know how he's going to pay the bills.
No.
You don't see the resolution of all the issues in the film.
Yeah, and I think in that respect, it's just real. This film, it's what happens in life. I mean, you don't get a nice ending with those loose endings tied up, and you know, oh, this is what's going to happen with me, and this is what's going to happen with person X and person Y, and it's just very true to life in that respect.
I don't really have the answer to this, but I think it manages to not answer all the questions, but not leave you wanting more.
Yes.
I'm not after a sequel to The Apartment. I don't want to know how it played out for them. I feel that the film completed a narrative journey without answering every single question.
I think that's something that we may get onto this later, but that's something that Billy Wilder does very well in his films, is that sense of resolving the film and not really resolving anything at all, but leaving you with the feeling that you're quite happy with things as they are, completely unresolved.
No world has changed here, but a lot's changed for people in that world.
Well, that should probably lead into recommendation.
I've got two for this week. One of the era and one not. The first one I'm going to recommend is Some Like It Hot. Most of you have seen this, but I think this very much is a similar film of a similar era, of a similar style, that often we think is a slapstick comedy but has got hidden depths to it.
My recommendations are now down from 2 to 1, because that was on mine as well. It's
Oh, I'm sorry.
I've
sorry.
got notes on this. Is Billy Wilder 1959.
Then I will leave the recommendation there and let you kind of fill in the gaps. The other one I'm going to recommend is, as we often said, this is the Kevin Smith podcast, is a film called Jersey Girl.
Okay.
Kevin Smith made Jersey Girl post The View Askew, and it did really badly. And I think that's because it doesn't play by the traditional rom-com rules in the same way this film doesn't. I don't think it's as masterful as this film. I don't think it's as good as this film. But I think that it is a modern rom-com that tries to do interesting work in the rom-com genre. Much like this film, it follows the narrative structure. It isn't like, completely out of left field as a rom-com, but it certainly subverts some of the tropes of that thing without being subversive.
Okay.
If that makes sense. I say, don't expect the quality you're getting in The Apartment from the Jersey Girl, but it's a modern version of the same kind of idea. I do think it is probably an underrated gem. I would say that it's not going to win an Oscar, it's not going to change your world, but I think it's far better than the stick it gets.
As I said, one of my recommendations this week was Some Like It Hot, which is partly for the fact that it's similar era. It's Billy Wilder the year before. Also has Jack Lemmon in it. And partly because this has an amazing last line, as The Apartment does. And my second recommendation would be from the early 70s. And it's also on the theme of brilliant endings. And it's one of my favourite films of all time. Certainly top 5, maybe top 1. Although there are others vying for that. It's The Sting from 1973. And this is
cool.
Possibly nostalgia because I saw it as a teen, and it's possibly also because I love heist movies and TV dramas. The rubbisher, the better. I mean, I could watch Hustle for hours, and have done. But also, this is one of the... It goes back to what we were saying about doing interesting things with genre. That this could be a film, a slapstick film, and it could be... I mean, it's not a musical, but there are times when you're reminded of, for example, the drama in Cat Ballou or in West Side Story, if they're not Guys and Dolls, something like that. But then there are deeply poignant moments in this between Redford and Paul Newman, and I think there's... I'm struggling to defend this choice for any other reason that I love this film, but I would say it's brilliant and well worth watching.
I will say this, that as teenagers you did turn me on to The Sting.
Good.
I hadn't heard of it until you recommended it to me, and I'm actually sitting at my desk looking at my VHS copy of it right now that I bought when I was probably 15 or 16 off your recommendation, and watched it and loved it alone.
Out of interest, how many VHSs do you have?
Somewhere around probably 200.
Are you still buying VHSs?
Yes, yeah, I bought about 5 the weekend. I've trimmed the collection a lot these days, so if I own it on DVD, I don't tend to keep the VHS, unless the VHS itself has meaning to me. Most of the collection is things that have just never made it to DVD, and are never going to make DVD. They are the video nasties, the 80s Sherlock horror sort of stuff, so that's what the collection is.
With trepidation there, I've got to say, what is your film for next week?
The next week, I think, having gone old school, it's time to go brand new school. So next week, we're going to be talking about Jurassic World.
Well, I look forward to that. I look forward to seeing it as well. I'm going to see it tomorrow evening. Please do get in touch, people. The Prestige Podcast on Twitter.
And you can find me at Kaiju Industries on Twitter.
And you can find me at life_academic.
And we will see you guys next week for some more film chatting all about Jurassic World.
Prestige is a Kaiju Industries production. Check out their other work at facebook.com/Kaiju Industries. Rawr! Arg.